Mr. Estes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity, and thank you for our witnesses for joining us today. I do want to introduce one comment just before I make my comments. Is one of the things that we need to make sure that when you're talking about tax rates and tax dollars paid, obviously the higher income folks, if you lower the rate, would pay less in taxes just because they paid more to start with. And at the end of the day, after the Trump tax cuts, they actually, higher income, still paid more taxes as a percentage of income tax that was totally collected. In fact, by the CBO data, according to the CBO data, Republican tax reform reduced federal taxes for every household across every income level, but increased the share of taxes for the top 1%. So I know it's as we talk through numbers, there's percentages and dollar amounts, but we need to make sure that what the true effect is. And I know as my friend from Georgia, Buddy Carter was talking about, there's a whole host of statistics we could talk about, whether it's the $36 trillion in debt that we're at, or the $75,000 to $100,000 a second, depending on which day you calculate the amount of money that's being borrowed. We've got to focus on several things. And instead of talking about that a little bit, I want to talk about something I know that Mr. Walker talked about in his presentation is DOGE and the government of the Department of Government Efficiency and the launch of the DOGE caucus here in Congress. I know it's going to present us with a wide range of options and recommendations. And these ideas are just starting to look at how do we reform our government spending and regulation. Just looking at, since President Biden came into office, there's been an additional federal cost of over $1.37 trillion just on the new regulations that were issued, which was about 45 times the calculated cost of President Trump during his President 45 administration, and also about 5 times more than regulatory costs during the Obama administration. So we've got to focus on that as the impact as well. Mr. Walker, during your years with the Government Accounting Office, can you give us a sense of just how much and how costly the unchecked executive branch rulemaking can be?
Well, DOGE is first yet to be defined. I think it's going to focus on organization of operations. Regulatory issues clearly should be within its scope because they impose cost and burdens on the private sector that constrain economic growth, among other things. And they also are going to try to end up helping save money. And to do that, they ought to look at things like the high-risk list from GAO. They ought to look at the duplication overlap and in redundancy report that comes out every year from GAO. They ought to look at the improper payments report that comes out every year from GAO and the inspectors general. They clearly ought to look at the regulatory burdens, but they also look at we have too many departments, we have too many regions, we have a number of different things that are based on the 1950s. And let me just close with this. As far as I know, I'm the only federal agency head that has transformed and right-sized a federal agency in the 21st century. We did this at GAO, which is government-wide. We made it 15% smaller, 50 to 100% more productive, 3 times the outcome-based results, second best place to work in the federal government, and 95% positive rating for the toughest client on earth, the U.S. Congress. So hopefully they'll learn from that and take a lot of those principles that are transferable and scalable to the rest of government. But that's only a down payment. We need the commission. We need a constitutional amendment.
Yeah, I would guess that most of the American public, including many of my colleagues, aren't aware that the high volume and high cost of some of these regulations that go on, and we need to address some of that within Congress. I mean, that's a lot of our responsibility now moving forward. Earlier this year, I was one of the co-sponsors for the Executive Cost Transparency Act, requiring the Congressional Budget Office to include in baseline a table delineating cost of judicial and executive actions since the publication of the last baseline, and helping make sure that we address any of those costs over $50 billion. Ms. Boccia, could you elaborate on how something increased transparency like the Executive Action Cost Transparency Act would help Congress better control excessive spending and hold administrations?
Yeah, at the Cato Institute, we aggregated the cost of emergency spending over the past 30 years, and we were shocked by what we found. We've spent about $14 trillion over the past 30 years by designating spending as for emergencies, and there is no government report that we were able to find that details those figures. And so emergency spending goes on outside of the budget process for the most part and is not subject to spending caps or rules like PAYGO. And that's where the lack of transparency and accountability starts. And so we need the Congressional Budget Office or the Government Accountability Office, or better yet, both, to actually aggregate, detail, and report to Congress on a regular basis the cost of emergencies, those that Congress has authorized, and also, importantly, those that the executive has declared, because that's also where there's a lack of transparency, and the Biden administration has refused to cooperate with Congress to report on executive emergency spending, so we don't even know how much they've been doing in that respect.
Yeah, well, thank you. And unfortunately, I'm out of time. There's so much we could talk about in terms of the out-of-control government spending and excessive rulemaking. And the pathway out of our fiscal crisis is a long one, but we've always got to address that both from the legislative side and the rulemaking side in order to help make sure that we have Americans, families, and businesses and farms that all thrive and continue to grow to keep America strong. So
thank you for your leadership.
I thank the gentleman from Kansas and yield 5 minutes to our friend